All right, folks, I think we're going to go ahead and try to get started. If you're not on mute, if you could place yourself on mute just so that we can go ahead and get moving along. I want to thank you all for your interest and taking the time out of your schedule to be here tonight. There's a lot going on with the election in Georgia in particular, and the Thanksgiving holiday coming. So I thought, given the rapid timeline of the public response period for this particular project, that it might be helpful just to gather together for us to share the observations we've made about the plan at a really high level, because it is almost 300 pages long and a lot of information to digest in a really short period of time. So I do want to let you know, for those of you I haven't had an opportunity to meet on this call, my name is Jessica. I'm the executive director of Wild Cumberland, and our entire team are volunteers, including the folks helping me tonight with the technical side of things. So I've got somebody running this presentation along with me who will have reference to a map at several times during our discussion. I am recording so that we can play this back for reference at another time. Feel free, if you'd like to turn off your video, to do so, but I want to make sure and let you know that it's being recorded. I will disclaim, we, along with other organizations, have asked for an extension on the public comment period for this project. We have not received any confirmation that that would happen, but we have asked, given particularly how much is going on and how complex this plan is, for a little bit more time. So I just want to let you all know that. And we may have some Park Service representation on the call tonight. And if that's the case, I want to say thanks for making the time to listen in and join. So we'll go ahead and get started in a second. I want to just tell you, this won't be necessarily a pretty presentation, because we managed to just slap some text on here so that you had some points of reference. But the first dozen or so slides go through sort of at a high level what the proposed changes are in the plan. There is an opportunity after we've run through those kind of quickly that we're going to then open it up to discussion and for conversation. I would like to hear about your concerns and your thoughts and feelings about the plan. And then before we leave, we'll give you a few tips on giving public comments that they can really utilize to improve this process. So I think it's important to acknowledge that the Park Service has suffered from a real lack of funding and staffing shortages, but there are increased demands on our park units, and people are seeking more remote and isolated experiences, like we find on Cumberland Island. So I think, there are a lot of reasons that this particular plan has come to the forefront. But Tyson, if you'll move us along, the visitor use management plan is a little further back. There we go. Thank you. Was shared, I think it was 2019, but COVID has skewed my brain a little, and what feels like happened in the last 3 years really might have happened longer ago. But it is designed to be an amendment to the 1984 General Management Plan for the park, and the impacts are really island-wide. This plan is very broad in its range and has been very thoughtfully done, I think. But it has effects on all types of user groups for the seashore. So, Ty, I want to make sure that we cover these in sort of buckets that might make sense or interest folks based on some of the conversations and questions that we've already received. The Park Service is having, of course, a public meeting separately next week. I hope most of you will also be able to attend that, and we'll provide that information tonight before we close out. But this covers sort of some of the hot topics that we've received questions about already. So there is a visitor number increase proposed of 700 or greater, depending on, I think, how you interpret some of the information in the plan. There are approximately 600 visitors they're scheduled to be delivered by ferry daily to both Sea Camp and Dungeness docks. But an additional 100 visitors can be delivered or may be delivered to Plum Orchard. So it also doesn't seem to account for the existing or commercial use and recreational boat use, which I hope we'll talk about a little more in depth, the recreational boat use happening on the intercoastal is obviously a big factor in sort of what these numbers really look like on the ground. We can move ahead. Ferry service. This is, sort of difficult to interpret. A lot of this plan is written in a way that follows something like an adaptive management policy, where they are inclined to take the data that they are seeing and apply it for best practices or to accommodate needs for the resource. So this isn't very specific about what more frequent and increased ferries or earlier and later departures really would look like. I know that it will likely, we all can imagine, coincide with peak times for visitation, which also coincide with, of course, some of our most highly protected species found in the waters surrounding the seashore. So I think that there's not perhaps enough information about those specifics to really get into that any further right now. There is also the introduction of a charter service listed, and I believe there are plans to run a water taxi from Fernandina to St. Mary's on a regular basis. I know that folks on the call who can speak to this much better and more expertly than myself, but for those of you who are unaware, the seaboard, the eastern seaboard marinas are about at 95% capacity all the time right now. And so the development we see in surrounding areas and the increase of recreational boats on our waters are really a reflection of a demand that already exists. And these things are being built to meet the demand. So I think it's important to think contextually about how that number will continue to increase. But let's move ahead so we can get through. This is a lot to take in. I know there's a suggestion of a retail store on island that would include these items listed here: health, safety, and essential camping items, merchandise, including books and souvenirs. And this location of that store and its impacts and the specifics of that are not really identified and detailed in this plan. We all know that the Department of Interior is moving toward eliminating single-use plastics in most of its or all of its units. So I would be very curious to see, how this would actually translate on a barrier island facing the risks that we know it does. So let's move on to the next. A lot of you have emailed me and asked me specifically about campsite changes, and certainly the Park Service, will be able to give you far more information than I can trying to absorb the entire plan in a week. But the 3 administrative sites that are currently located at Sea Camp would be converted for public use to increase capacity in the Sea Camp area. They're also planning to open the Hunt Camp that's adjacent to Plum Orchard. Many of you may not be familiar with Hunt Camp, but I hear rumors there's even hot water there. And so they would be making that up available to the public. And then they have the addition of a Beach Creek's campsite. And Ty, after I read through this list, I'll ask you to show maybe the map so we can look at exactly where these locations are. Beach Creek is on the very southernmost portion of the island at the Georgia-Florida line, where we're absorbing a lot of recreational boat, impacts to begin with. You can see it at the very bottom of the screen there, at the very bottom pink location. That is a proposed campsite for the addition of up to 18 campers. Ty, if you'll slip back. Thanks. There is the Sweetwater Lakes campsite, where for those of you familiar with Lake Whitney, it is located on the northernmost portion of the island. And there it is marked, thank you, with the little pink spot. This is the Park Service's map, which is page 35. For those of you who have the plan or want to reference this map on your own, it is page 35 in the plan. And then this particular campsite is located next to Lake Whitney. As most of you know, it's an important place because it's the largest freshwater lake on any of Georgia's barrier islands. But they are suggesting a campsite about 250 feet from there, and using Lake Whitney as the water source for that particular location. So Tunahowie, for those of you unfamiliar with that location, this will probably be the last time, Ty, I ask you to slide over to the map for this particular slide. tuna howies there on the left side of the island on the west side. And it was formerly a developed piece of property that has since been available to the Park Service. It does face the water, and there are suggestions of motorized boat access to allow access to the wilderness there. So, and then Yankee Paradise has been eliminated in this particular plan altogether. So those are the changes that at a high level that support what this plan covers for campers or campsites specifically. And so, Ty, we can move on. I know I'm moving pretty quickly, but I really do want to give everybody a chance to ask some questions. So have them, drop them in the chat, and we can make sure to revisit them or write them down. And certainly we'll make sure we get back to them. Nightingale Beach and Trail. This is the section of beach that runs between Dungeness and Sea Camp. Look at that. Thank you so much. So it's down there, and you see an addition of another pink little triangle, or I've got my glasses on. There's a couple little pink spots there. Right here, they have suggested a pavilion or a shade pavilion of sorts, and putting in the infrastructure to support restrooms and I believe outdoor showers of some capacity. So there are certainly implications here of various kinds, but this would require and be part of some realignment of trails on the south end. We'll talk about a little further into the slides. So thank you. This here, I pulled some of this data just so maybe you don't have to go looking for it. I'm happy to give you a reference in this document as to where you can find more information on the things that matter the most to you. But this gives you some linear footage about how far this new trail would go, and sort of where it would be is visible on the map to a degree. The bathhouse, again, restroom, showers, it would require a water utility line and potentially crossing the main road. They've suggested solar electricity, or it would require an additional line, but that level of detail is not included in the plan. And then the septic leach field and a new pavilion with the approximate square footage, 800 square feet there. So this aligns with other changes in the vicinity, including the South End Trail. So they would like to realign these so they stay a little further, I think, upland and out of some marshland, and would allow beach access. So this way you would actually be able to access the beach from Nightingale Trail, which you cannot do at this time. Ty, if you'll go ahead. Thank you. In this same vicinity, and after this, take the map again, but they are suggesting this particular boat landing kind of anchoring area. Thank you. All the way down at almost the Florida line. And there are good reasons that they've potentially proposed a solution like this. There is a great deal of recreational boat traffic on a very delicate portion of, and a very important portion of the island, much of which is in critical habitat area for piping plover and turtles and probably red knot soon, if not already. But I have some concerns about potentially the maybe methodology or data available about how that would work. They're suggesting that this landing zone for boats would shift depending on conditions, and that it would be delineated by these types of things, markers, signage, and flagging, and include a whole lot of signage. So I've seen this employed in other instances and maybe not very effectively, but this is something that I know concern a lot of our folks who care about our shorebirds and our nesting birds in particular. This area would be off limit to dogs, and pedestrian access would remain at the Dungeness crossing. But this is a real, it's going to get a lot of activity, particularly with the increase in recreational boat use, and would require near constant enforcement or oversight, even with these mitigation pieces in place as we see them. The Beach Creek campsite that we looked at earlier also is suggesting that might be accessible to motorized boats. So you would have boats going pretty far back up, it looks like, into some of that marshland there. They're suggesting a no wake zone would be applied, but again, it would take near constant enforcement in order to ensure something like that actually took place. So the South End has a whole lot of activity going on. This gets more specifically into some of those trails and some of those changes, boardwalk, et cetera. A new pavilion also on the South End at Dungeness, and it has been considered as a potential location for the kayak and canoe rentals that they would like to establish. So we'll look at the map a little more in detail in a minute, but let's slide on through so that we can make sure we cover everything that might matter to this group. Bicycles. This plan would certainly serve as public input on bicycles, and they are suggesting the Park Service would like to limit the bikes at 100 a day. This plan would also authorize bike use further north on the actual beach to Stafford. But I think most concerning to me is that it would open up trails and administrative roads to bikes as well, which, as you'll see delineated on the map, takes people in some routes that historically have only been restricted or were restricted to the main road by its designation as a road. So this number, I think 100 sort of comes out of what's in the concessionaire agreement with the ferry, what could be renegotiated in the ferry, what the ferry boat schedule might look like, and other things, but I'm not sure it accounts for the number of recreational boaters that many of us have seen bringing over bikes, residential bikes, and then there's also obviously commercial use on the island that employs bicycles. So I don't really see all of these numbers reflected in any sort of environmental analysis for, especially in conjunction with things like 700 visitors and various other pieces of this plan. Okay, keeping us moving, I'll try wilderness changes. I know that's big to probably a lot of the people in this group tonight. This would sort of provide access potentially from Plum Orchard directly into the adjacent wilderness, potentially on that road there, and allowing people different access to the wilderness than is outlined previously. It would increase capacity on from my best understanding, this is they're allowing 72 people at the campsites, and then they account for 138 on the trails at any given time, giving that combined number of 210. So there's these things, some of these things we covered in sort of citing earlier on about where some of these locations were. So I think we can move on from that one. Okay, almost there. You saw kayak and canoe rental, possibly guided. They don't know this plan doesn't offer a site specific location, whether that would be at Plum Orchard, they're at the Sea Camp Ranger Dock or at Dungeness. All of those have been cited as a potential. We don't know the size of the operation. We don't know what that would mean. They do suggest some signage and better, education, but we don't have a lot of detail to be able to really speak to the potential impacts or ramifications of those kinds of pieces in this puzzle. They are suggesting a South End shuttle service, which I feel like was around maybe before this plan, or the idea of it was, but it would be running people, I think, from Sea Camp to Plum, staying within that legally mandated 8 tours a day that's reflected in the legislation from 2004. This goes very in depth for those of you interested in commercial use of the seashore. This plan goes very in depth about the types of commercial use they would authorize or allow, and they were very thorough in that regard. It's something that is going to take a little time to probably sift through. And then I've gotten more than one question about this line that was somewhere about a possible fence around Plum Orchard Pond. That's a really special place for a lot of people, and wildlife. And so I think seeing a mention about Plum Orchard Pond fenced off potentially, whether for natural resource protection or people protection or not, really seem to resonate with some of you. So I just wanted to address that and make sure that I acknowledged I'd received that question a couple of times from folks. So, all right, almost there. This is just some sort of contextual things I think it's important to remember when we evaluate all of the specific items that they have suggested, that the Park Service has suggested is appropriate to accommodate more visitors at the seashore. And that is its enabling legislation, because every unit's legislation is written differently. And Cumberland Island has a very specific purpose. And I can't read this as well as it's probably written, but the seashore shall be permanently preserved in its primitive state, and no development of the project or plan for the convenience of visitors shall be undertaken, which would be incompatible with the preservation of the unique flora and fauna or the physiographic conditions now prevailing. And I think, you know, they've done a nice job of being thoughtful about how some of these changes could impact the seashore, but I think the group has some probably questions about how that aligns with this particular language. So let's keep running through. And then I want to get to discussion. Again, I mentioned earlier that there's other external pieces that sort of aren't really covered in this. We know that there is the potential rezoning and development of acreage immediately adjacent to Sea Camp currently that is not mentioned or sort of planned for one way or the other in this. And then we know that this plan, very disappointingly, I think to myself, was in development, but not able to be evaluated by the public when they made decisions about Spaceport Camden. I think that's rather terrible. And then there have been some items excluded from consideration, and those items can be found in Appendix K. One of those for this group in particular is that the feral horses have been excluded from consideration as to how they relate to visitor use. I think that there's no way we can look at over 700 people on the island as a conservative figure with the wildlife we currently have and think that that's not going to become an issue of public safety at some point. Then there's the monitoring, the data, the mitigation measures that I just sort of would like to have seen in a more detailed or robust fashion to be able to really give feedback on some of these elements. There's a lot of argument to be made that the Park Service as an agency is looking to make our parks more accessible to more people, and I'm here for that. But I think that more ferries and charter services without real changes to the fee structure and the other barriers that prevent people from getting to Cumberland Island, it only facilitates access for the same demographic. And there's even a mention, you know, about how ferry fees could rise if the concessionaire has to, you know, upgrade its equipment or incurs too many costs. So I don't think we're looking at a solution by more ferry boats to make the island more accessible to different types of user groups and people. And again, the adjacent communities development is something that I think is not contextualized well in this plan. Recreational boat use is going to continue to rise exponentially. And for those of you unaware or can't keep up with all the things, because I can't keep up with half of it these days. But St. Mary's is developing a 52-acre marina with like 400 new boat slips, 200 wet, 200 dry, I think. And there's another one in progress. So there's a lot of demand and access demand for access to our waters on the intercoastal. And there, so much so that Georgia DNR now has a long-term mooring permit process because so many boats are staying for such lengths of time in our waterways that waste and shellfish and all of those things have to be monitored a little closely and a little differently. So these are all things that I think we have to contextualize. Then there's this small list, and I promise I'm almost done talking and I want to hear from you. But separate funding, these things are sort of going on, but also not really reflected or integrated into this plan. The Grange is on its like final round of funding. If not, it's already done for restoration, and how the Grange would work for visitor use isn't really reflected here. They've got funding to grade the road, which would help to potentially mitigate some of the increased vehicular traffic from additional tours and commercial use, et cetera. The ranger station, I was there this week, and there's a giant hole in the ceiling, and maybe they're just leaving it because they're about to rehab the ranger station. But they do have separate funding to rehab the ranger station and the camper bathroom, which is already underway. So I would also be curious to how those accommodations or facilities that have already been funded and planned for would be able to absorb the level of infrastructure required to handle this many people, if these facilities are being renovated and built for the current visitor use, or if it's for projected use based on this plan. I also note that they received some great funding for a shoreline restoration project. I don't really know a lot of details about that. And of course, we've all heard probably or tried to go by the Mainland Museum recently, and it is now closed for some upgrades. So these are all additional pieces of what the seashore has going on. And so I think it's really important that with limited staff, limited funding, limited resource, the public who cares so much about this place has an opportunity to engage and really give feedback about what's happening in this plan. And I'm afraid the 30 days is woefully inadequate for many of you to do it. So giving you, I hope, this high level of and running through it really fast is hard to absorb. All of this, I hope many of you have been able to spend some time with it already. I know some of you on this call have reached out to me, or we've had an opportunity to speak in detail about your concerns, but I want to make sure I shut up and hear from you all. And if you would like to unmute, or if you'd like to type a question in chat, I encourage you to do so. I'd love to mute myself and just hear a little bit about your impressions of this plan when you read it, or if there's anything I haven't covered here that's really important to you. If you, let's just kind of start there. Is there anybody who may have something? If you want to raise your hand or just unmute, it's a really tough space to be the first person to ask a question on something like this. Ty, can you make that any bigger for us, maybe? I know this makes it really hard. The colored map in the plan is great. I only printed in black and white because it's a really long. And so I keep referring back to the screen here. Okay, somebody asked me if the Park Service would be allowing questions at next week's event, and the format for the meeting has not been shared to my knowledge, and certainly if there's anybody with more knowledge than myself, I'd be glad to hear it, but I do not know if it will be simply a presentation or if you'll have an opportunity to ask questions directly and receive answers. So somebody asked me here, has the Park Service, or asked in chat, has the Park Service been receiving complaints from people who have not been able to get on the island? If not, why are they increasing the number allowed? Certainly, St. Mary's as a gateway community, I think, is in need of economic infusion. And, 80%, something like 80% of the revenue from St. Mary's businesses depend on tourists to the seashore. And there's increased demand. Certainly, I think recreation.gov has had a lot of hiccups on access. The process of booking a campsite, of being able to walk up and get reservations, the technical limitations that recreation.gov puts on certain groups of users, I think has maybe caused some issues. I get complaints regularly about folks who would like to book and aren't there. You'll see in this plan too, they've they've given some numbers about how many sites they will close at any given time in order to help protect the resource. But if you sort of consider that, not all of the sites are open at all times, that is important. Okay, so thanks for answering that, Michael. The November 17th will be a presentation, but also allow for questions and answers. So for those questions I can't answer or that you want to hear from the Park Service on directly, it sounds like you'll be able to ask, and that's great. Have there been studies on looking at gopher turtle locations? Could there be a disruption with these additional sites? So each species is sort of evaluated in here. Every threatened or listed species is evaluated in here, and you can see the logic that they apply for each project to that species. And they are also in consultation, according to this document, with the agencies who would also help to provide mitigation measures or a plan for those types of disruptions if they were to happen. So that is something that the Park Service will have to speak about specifically in more detail than I can tell you from my read right now of that particular section. Certainly, though, if there's a gopher tortoise expert on here, like, speak up, because that's not me. Let's see here. And I know, yeah, the park has done studies on gopher tortoise. I do know that, and fairly recently. So they certainly have some data available. Great.
Okay, can I ask a question?
Please.
Okay. Well, just about the camping. Well, I have two questions. With the camping sites will all be primitive. Is that correct?
Correct. None of the additional sites that they're putting in, the Tuna Howie, the Sweetwater, and to my knowledge, Beach Creek, will all be primitive sites. Correct.
Okay. It seems to me with all that increased activity on the island that you're going to have policing, and I mean, it's just going to get just so much more commercial and not different than some of the other parks, where you go to that are islands. And I think, Cumberland is so unique. I just hate to see it.
This is Kim Waits with Wild Alabama, and yes, I absolutely agree with that statement that you just made. Because it's the saying, if you build it, they will come. With any kind of increase in visitor use, there will be an increase in search and rescue and incidents on the island. And I'm just curious to know what kind of infrastructure or response contingency plans they have for the increase in that. Will they be able to handle it? Yeah, and I'll just now that I'm opening my mouth and I have the platform, my main concern, being a wilderness historian and a supporter of wilderness, typically in national forest lands, my main concern is the impact on wilderness character. The impact on wilderness character is already degraded severely with everything that's in place now with the visitor use management restrictions and just various infrastructure that degrades the opportunity for unconfined recreation and solitude. And with this increase that they're suggesting, it just even further degrades wilderness character. There's so many things that that I'm seeing and reading in this plan, but also the increase in conflict between visitors and just the wildlife. And and I'll tell my personal story and then I'll shut up because Jessica knows I could go on about this forever. But I was just there on Cumberland Island last week, and I was sitting on the beach enjoying bird watching, and there was a grouping of probably a few hundred birds of various species. I was the only person there within probably a quarter mile. And coming north from Sea Camp area were 4 people on bicycles. One of the people on the bicycle veered off from the group and deliberately rode their bicycle through that grouping of birds, which flushed them into flight, degrading my experience for one, but from the wildlife perspective, it was leave no trace principle number 6, disrespecting or needing to respect wildlife. So I'm just seeing, with an increase of everything, you're just seeing more incidents, and it's much interp as you can put in, and as much things that you put in place. Being in land management myself, I have seen boots on the ground, real-time ground truth of what actually happens is so the antithesis of what you're seeing on paper. I mean, this document is 300 papers of, in a perfect world, this is what we'd really like to see. But in reality, and I've been seeing it for 2 decades, it's so much different. You can say education all day long, but in real life, it's really hard to enforce. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Yes, that's what I was trying to say. Yeah, you said that good.
Thanks for sharing your experience and perspective.
You're very welcome.
I want to make sure everybody has had a chance. I tried to sort of address, when I prepared some of these slides I put together, I tried to really base them on some of the questions and feedback I feel like we've already received, because I just haven't had time to respond to individual emails and dig into this. So I hope, if I haven't answered a question that you've sent me previously, or if you have a question following this, certainly I hope, number one, you attend the Park Service meeting next week, but feel free to reach out to me directly. If my technical assistant is available still, and he may not be, but let's slide back into the presentation. And so here you can find this information all certainly electronically, and we can send it out. You don't have to write down any links, but they have a virtual public meeting scheduled. It's a different platform, it's Teams, and sometimes that can give people hiccups when they get ready to go to a meeting. So please make sure you give it a try, and that your machine is up to date with what you need to be able to participate at 6 o'clock next week. And there's a link directly to the plan on the Park Service website. You can also find that on ours, but you're going to need to send your comments by November 30th, unless an extension is granted, so the public has a little more time with this material, via the website. Now, if you're locally, you can hand deliver the comments, or you can certainly make sure they're postmarked by the 30th, but you need to make sure that you're keeping this timeline in mind. Sharing it is also obviously very important. It's a very busy time of year to cut through the clutter of elections and holidays and Thanksgiving. And I would really hate to see some of the folks who've been really vested in the place for a long time miss an opportunity to give their feedback and potentially improve the results of something like this. And then if we'll slide forward, this is important. You know, the Park Service was very specific when they sent out this information, and they want particular pieces of feedback. And so if, when you craft your comments, you can be specific in these ways, it will help them to employ your feedback in the most impactful way. So they don't really want to hear why you do and don't like it, unless you give them some pretty substantial reasons. And they are concerned about the accuracy of the plan, the adequacy of the information, whether it's complete, robust, full enough for you to make a decision, and their analysis, you know, on threatened and endangered species, on your visitor experience, on these lovely models and projections and things that they've used to determine, you know, the recommendations they have here. They want your feedback on that. They don't want to hear that you just disagree with making Cumberland like Disneyland, or, you know, that they're looking for very specific recommendations you could make that would provide an alternative or explain to them why their knowledge or data set might be factually incorrect. It's a big ask for people on this call who are already committed to a lot of other causes and things. So we've provided a few steps. I don't know if this will be helpful to anyone or not, and I will certainly send all of this out to everyone. But including this type of personal information, I got several questions about why we haven't created a new form for something like this, but we saw effectively with Spaceport that agencies can often discredit duplicative comments. So in other words, if you, just because you align with maybe everything I have in my letter, if you copy and paste that and put your name on it, they may very well discredit both of those letters. So adding another layer of complexity to ensuring our voices are heard in this system. These are some suggestions. When you introduce yourself, maybe speak specifically about your relationship with the seashore, give it some context, explain that, you know, you are someone who, for instance, maybe has been coming for 30 years, or maybe it's been on your bucket list for 30 years and now you have less interest in coming. But, and then slide on down to number 2. Your feedback. You know, these are some of the topics we talked about tonight that might matter and that I have received a lot of feedback on. And so, you know, if there are pieces of this that matter the most to you, you know, that's what you want to spend your time on. And then certainly tie number 3 is if you feel like there are alternatives or errors or omissions, the accuracy and detail of the plan as it stands. And again, if you have specific alternatives or suggestions to items that they have proposed for the seashore, I would encourage you to give them. So finally, number 4, well, thank you. You know, it's great to be able to public comment. And it is. That process exists for a reason, so that stakeholders who have information that maybe the managing agencies or the a lack of consistent or intrinsic knowledge about a place can offer value and make sure that we are coming together for a solution that will make the most of the circumstances we're facing. So can we say alternative that we prefer no change? I cannot guarantee they will accept that feedback or take that feedback into consideration. I think it's always important to say how you feel. I wish we felt like we had a little more choice in the way that visitor use would be employed, or that that's a tough one. We have also, again, I mentioned we requested an extension. You can ask for one yourself as a member of the public. There's nothing to stop you from emailing the Seashore or the regional office or anywhere else and telling them that 30 days is not enough time for you to review this plan, and can they give you more? Your elected officials can also help to sometimes move those things along, and they are your elected officials who are here to help your relationships with federal agencies and processes that we're struggling with. So I think it's perfectly acceptable for you to do that. And then mostly sharing this. It's a really tough time of year to cut through this stuff. So I think that we've been hearing, I'm sorry that your local official supports the spaceport. I mean, even sending it to our senators, connect with me, Christy, and we'll get somebody to pay attention if that's the request you'd like to make. Certainly, though, I would start with the local management and let them know how you feel about it, because always, you know, start there when you have feedback to give. So that being said, you know our website. If you're here, you're really invested. If you're here, you really care about a place or what's going to happen to this particular place, and you likely have insight that's really valuable. And to the Park Service, to our organization, we are going to be obviously working on pretty in-depth comments, and I will provide this poor little presentation so that you all reference it later, and the links so that you can click on them without having to type them. But my email is there. You can find us on social. We're not on Twitter anymore. Musk made me leave, so I need to update this slide, but you can find us at all of these places. Many of you also know how to reach me directly by phone if it's really got a burning question or need some help with something. So I appreciate your willingness to be here. And, you know, I wanted to try and keep it under an hour for everybody. I wasn't sure how many questions we have. I'm happy to hang on for a few minutes if there are folks who maybe want to stay and chat or maybe didn't want to ask questions in the larger group. But I really do appreciate your willingness to engage on something that will really change the face of the seashore in a lot of ways. There are some hardworking folks who've come before us to help ensure that it has remained like it is for as long as it has. And I think there are increasingly fewer places like it. And we have to show a great deal more restraint to ensure that something comparable still exists one day. So,
Jessica.
Yeah.
Hi, thanks very much for this presentation. My question is, can we use the origin statement about Cumberland that you showed earlier in the slideshow, use that as a basis for arguing that these changes are not consistent with that origin statement? I mean, I'm not a technical person, a planner like the Park Service officials. I can't argue whether, you know, the new dock would be 2 feet too long or you know, the pavilion is you know, not planned right. I really can't address those things that way, in a way they're expecting to hear.
Yeah, I encourage you to give that feedback. I think the way that the instruction was provided, it reads to me, and pardon my directness, like we're doing this, so tell us what you think and let's move on.
Yeah, sounds like it, yeah.
And I think the lack of real engagement is what seals the deal, right? Like they're not really having conversations with stakeholders, with groups who really could offer feedback of value to get to a better place. And, you know, it's kind of a fast, accelerated timeline. And I don't think that that's fair to the public or the resource ultimately. Yes, I will make this recording available. Absolutely. I will be happy to do that. So I can follow up with this group and make a copy of the presentation and the recording available just as soon as our volunteers have time to square all that stuff away. So, and again, feel free to reach out to me directly if there's anything you'd like to discuss in detail. I think, you know, comments are about the quality of thinking, and it's going to be hard to get quality of thinking on a project like this at such a busy time. So I encourage you all to reach out to your personal networks and professional networks where appropriate, and I'm happy to connect with anybody after this. So enjoy your evening. Those of you on the coast, please stay safe. I hope all infrastructure fares well, and for those from a couple of different time zones, thanks for accommodating. This is a really big change and a lot of really big changes. So, all right, I will mute myself, but I'm here if anybody wants to stay on and chat. So thank you all.